This video was sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Hone, and it's that time again, limited set review season. The full card gallery for Dungeons & Dragons Adventures in the Forgotten Realms went up earlier today, and that means it's time to start my limited set review. In this series, I'll be giving you my thoughts on every single card in the set, specifically talking about how I think they will fare in the limited format. I use letter grades to sum up my thoughts about each card, and if you're new to my set reviews, you can find a guide to what those grades mean in the description. The schedule for this review was going to differ from how I usually do it, and this is because the amount of time we have between the full set being revealed and the format being draftable on Magic Arena is very, very short. The card gallery did go up today, and you'll be able to start playing the new format on Magic Online and Arena on July 8th. I'm still endeavoring to get the whole set review out by the day the format is available online, but to do that, I had to divide the review into 3 parts instead of 6. This means the videos will be longer, and today, instead of just looking at white, we'll be looking at multicolored and colorless cards too. Alright, let's get started with a look at multicolor cards. This will allow us to be introduced to the various archetypes and themes in the set before we get into the other cards. First up, it's Adult Gold Dragon, which for 3 generic, a red and a white is a 4/3 dragon at rare, and it has flying, lifelink, and haste. This has a bunch of keywords and awesome stats. Flying, lifelink, and haste combine quite well, as they can help you to quickly put the game out of reach for your opponent. The dragon will often be able to hit your opponent at least once, even if they have removal, and any more than that, and you're talking about a massive gap in life totals that goes in your favor. The one disadvantage the Gold Dragon has is that 3 toughness can die to a whole lot of things, but I still think the combination here is quite nice, though probably not quite a bomb. While it doesn't definitely give you value even if it dies, haste plus lifelink and flying does a good job of giving it a pretty good chance to do that. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Bard class. So there's a whole cycle of enchantment classes in this set for the 12 different classes in Dungeons & Dragons, and one of those is Bard. They're enchantments with a special subtype of class, and then you can pay mana to level up your class. And Bard class is a red and a green for a rare enchantment class. And it starts out at level 1, and that level 1 says, legendary creatures you control into the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on them. Level 2 lets you pay a red and a green, that's how you get to level 2, and once you're there, you also get the effect legendary spells you cast cost a red and a green less to cast. This effect reduces only the amount of colored mana you pay, and then at level 3, you can get there by paying 3 generic, a red and a green if you're at level 2. And if you are there, it says whenever you cast a legendary spell, exile the top 2 cards of your library, you may play them this turn. So if you're level 3, you get all 3 of these effects. So this set does have a significant number of legendaries in it, but I don't think there's enough to really make this something that's easy to build around. It is all about legendaries, and does literally nothing if you don't have enough of them. I could give it a build around grade, but I think it will be so difficult to make this work that I don't need to go there. If you could get it going, it would be powerful, but I just don't see it happening. I think it's probably just a D. Next up, we have Barrowin of Clan Undur, which for 2 generic, a white and a black, is a 3/3 dwarf cleric, a legendary one, at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, you venture into the dungeon. So that's a new mechanic in this set. I have the 3 dungeons on the screen here too. These are interesting because they're not cards you draft, they're just cards you have, and they sort of exist outside of the game. And anytime you venture into a dungeon, the first time, you pick one of these dungeons, and you get the effect from the very first room. Then, when you venture into dungeons after that, you move into a new room. Eventually, you can complete the dungeon, and then if you venture again, you get to choose another dungeon. And you can see they're significantly different from one another. The Lost Mine of Phandelver and the Tomb of Annihilation are both fairly easy to complete, but the Tomb of Annihilation has all kinds of wacky symmetrical effects. You know, trapped entry, each player loses 1 life. Then, if you go to Oubliette, you have to discard a card, sack an artifact, a creature, and a land, and that one's not even symmetrical. But if you do get to the last room of this, you get a 4/4 Black God creature token with Death Touch. Similarly, the Lost Mine, you can get through it pretty quickly. The reward's not quite as good, but there's some nice value because you get to scry first, then you get a treasure token or make a goblin, and then you get to choose between 3 different effects, one that weakens a creature, one that puts a counter somewhere, one that drains life, and then when you get to the last room, you draw a card. Dungeon of the Mad Mage is the one that takes the longest to complete, but you can sort of grind out more value with it. If you're less interested in completing dungeons, Dungeon of the Mad Mage might be the one for you. because it gives you so many different effects that you get to use, but you do have to advance through all these rooms with cards that have Venture, like Barrow here. So I'm not going to show, all of these dungeons again every time we talk about a card with Venture, but I will talk about them and show them in the first card in each video that does Venture, and in this case, it's Barrow. So Barrow has that strong enter the battlefield trigger that lets you Venture. This effect isn't quite as good probably as Learn. However, it does have some similarities in that you sort of grind out value for cards that aren't even in your deck with these Venture effects. And, you can see you can get creatures, you can get treasure tokens, you can get all kinds of nice value out of them. So Barrow helps you Venture, and then when it attacks, you return up to one creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard, but you only get to do that if you've completed a dungeon. So Black-White, the main theme for Black-White in general is Venture. It's one of the color pairs built around Venture. This is the signpost uncommon for it. And it seems to be the color pair most interested in completing dungeons, which means if you're playing Black-White, you probably go for the Lost Mine of Phandelver or the Tomb of Annihilation, so you can complete a dungeon quickly and start getting powerful effects, like the one Barrow gives you here, which allows you to reanimate something directly to your graveyard. Overall, Barrow is a pretty good card. I think it's a strong enough signpost uncommon you take it early. And obviously, if you complete dungeons, you're going to be really raking in value with Barrow, though generally, he's not going to survive the attack that he makes. But still, I think this is quite a good card. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, we have Brunor Battlehammer, who for 2 generic, a red, and a white is a 5/3 legendary dwarf warrior at uncommon. And each creature you control gets +2/+0 for each equipment attached to it. And you can pay 0 rather than pay the equip cost of the first equip ability you activate each turn. So, red-white, something we've seen a lot, it's an aggro deck that really cares about equipment. And this creature has a pretty reasonable floor as a 4-mana 5/3. You'd be playing him if you only have one piece of equipment to take advantage of, too, so you don't have to build around him hardcore for him to be good. And once you do have equipment, his 2 equipment bonuses are pretty incredible. His equip cost of 0 on the first equip each turn and an additional stats boost for equipment is pretty great. He takes some building around to really take advantage of, but again, he has such a reasonable floor, and he's not going to be that hard to build around. There's a lot of equipment in this set that's playable. I think overall you can take him early, and I'm giving him a B. Next up, it's Drist Do Erden, and I apologize in advance if I'm saying these Dungeons & Dragons characters' names wrong. I've never played it myself, and I did look up pronunciation for these, and I'm trying my best, but I may screw some of them up. Let me know in the comments if I do. But anyway, Drist Do Erden is 3 generic, a green, and a white for a 3/3 elf ranger at rare. He's got double strike. When he enters the battlefield, you create Gwen Hwyvar, a legendary 4/1 green cat creature token with trample, and whenever a creature dies, if it had power greater than Drist's power, put a number of +1/+1 counters on him equal to the difference. So a 5-mana 3/3 with double strike is probably already a playable card like a C- or a C, and this does way more than that. Just when he comes down, you pay 5 mana for 8/4 worth of stats across 2 bodies with very real keyword abilities, and that would probably be enough for this to be an easy B. But then you add the fact that Drist gets bigger when creatures with higher power die, and you're talking about a bomb. Especially because the 4/1 dying will make Drist into a 4/4, so there's built-in synergy. You don't have to go really hard on really making Drist good, he just will be. This is an A. Next up, it's Faraday Devil's Chosen, which for 2 generic, a blue and a red, is a 3/3 tiefling warlock at uncommon. It's legendary. And whenever you roll 1 or more dice, Faraday Devil's Chosen gains flying and menace until end of turn, and if any of those results was 10 or higher, draw a card. So there's a couple things going on in this card that we've never really seen before. One of them is that there are these flavor keyword abilities. This one says Dark One's Own Luck. Most of them don't really mean anything other than giving you some flavor. And the other thing is, this card cares about you rolling dice, and indeed, Blue-Red's archetype is all about rolling dice, which will be interesting and fits well into a Dungeons & Dragons set. Flying in Menace usually just means unblockable, and you'll also draw a card about half the time, which makes Faraday pretty silly. There are a lot of cards in this set that have you roll a d20 at lower rarities, and it's not going to be that hard to really take advantage of Faraday, and I think this is another really good signpost uncommon and one you can take pretty highly, giving it a B. Just drawing cards and attacking with this thing in the air is going to feel great. Next up, it's Fighter class, which for a red and a white is a rare enchantment class. At level 1, it lets you search your library for an equipment card, reveal it, and put it into your hand when it enters the battlefield. Level 2, and you can get there by paying 1 generic, a red, and a white, makes it so your equip abilities cost 2 less to activate. And level 3, and you can get there by paying 3 generic, a red and a white, says whenever a creature you control attacks up to one target creature, blocks it this combat if able. So, if you have some equipment, this does a nice job of tutoring it up off the bat, which isn't too bad, especially if you have some of the higher rarity equipment. The tutor effect alone wouldn't really be enough for limited, but leveling it up does make your equipment significantly better. Level 3 is honestly kind of disappointing power level wise. Your average red-white deck will have some equipment to be sure, that's part of the color pairs theme as we've already seen, but if you just have like 3 and they're just kind of average, this won't be great. Probably something like a D+. But if you end up with more equipment than that and or some of the more powerful equipment, it probably moves up to a B-. Next up, it's Gretchen Titchwillow, which for a green and a blue is a 0/4 legendary halfling druid at uncommon, and you can pay 2 generic, a green and a blue to draw a card, and you may put a land from your hand onto the battlefield. This reminds me enough of River Hoopo that I'm pretty excited about it. That stat line is passable for a defensive creature that does something else, and Gretchen definitely does, supplying you with a very powerful mana sink ability that will be a lifesaver in the late game. The extra land part of the card won't always matter, since most of the time when you start using this ability, you're probably not going to be in desperate need of more lands, but it could definitely help, especially in blue-green, which is a ramp color pair as it often is, and as Gretchen is telling you here. I'm giving her a B-. Next up, it's Hama Pashar, Ruin Seeker, which for 1 generic, a blue and a white is a 2/3 legendary human wizard at uncommon, and she says room abilities of dungeons you own trigger in additional time. Blue-white is another color pair all about dungeons, especially triggering them with Enter the Battlefield abilities, and getting 2 triggers out of dungeon rooms is pretty powerful. Hama is definitely small for the cost, but I don't see it being very difficult to get a ton of value out of her, giving her a B. Next up, it's Kalain, Reclusive Painter, which for a black and a red is a 1/2 human elf bard at rare, another legendary, and when it enters the battlefield, you make a treasure token. Other creatures you control enter the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on them for each mana from a treasure spent to cast them. A 2-mana 1/2 that makes a treasure is already a pretty good deal, but this adds all kinds of upside that will be amazing in the black-red deck, which is all about treasure. Even all on its own, it's pretty likely that the treasure you make will help you play a creature and put a +1/+1 counter on it on your next turn, and that's some serious value. If you manage to really get treasure going with Kalain, she will undoubtedly take over games. She is certainly fragile, but the fail case is that you still get to keep a single treasure, and that helps make that a little less of a problem. This is a really strong signpost uncommon, I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Krydle of Baldur's Gate, which for a blue and a black is a 1/3 legendary human elf rogue at uncommon, and when it deals combat damage to a player, that player loses 1 life and mills a card, and then you gain 1 life and scry 1, and whenever you attack, you can pay 2 generic. If you do, target creature can't be blocked this turn. This seems like a really great signpost uncommon. Blue-black seems to be about doing combat damage to an opponent with evasive creatures and getting various triggers, and Krydle definitely showcases how great that can be. His combat trigger is pretty awesome. It allows him to do 2 damage at a time while gaining you life and allowing you to improve your draws. Even if he couldn't make himself and other creatures unblockable, Krydle would be pretty good, but he can do that, and in the late game, he can just produce lethal damage out of nowhere. This seems like an amazing uncommon, one that you'll take very highly, giving it a B. Next up, it's Minsk, Beloved Ranger, which for a red, a green, and a white is a 3/3 legendary human ranger at Mythic Rare. When he enters the battlefield, you create Boo, a legendary 1/1 red hamster creature token with trample and haste, and he has an activated ability that you can pay X generic mana for, and until end of turn, target creature you control has base power and toughness XX, and becomes a giant in addition to its other types, activate only as a sorcery. This is one of the more fun cards in the set, especially because, like Minsk, I'm a bald guy who owns a hamster. But anyway, Minsk is the only 3-color card in the set, but I do think he is fairly castable. There are treasures and other forms of fixing in this format, so casting him won't be crazy difficult, though don't expect it to just happen either. But if you can cast him, you get a 3/3 and a 1/1, and the ability to turn creatures huge, including Minsk's hamster buddy. The casting cost definitely holds him back, but he looks pretty good overall, giving him a B. Next up, we've got Monk class, which for a blue and a white is a rare enchantment class, and its level 1 effect says the second spell you cast each turn costs 1 less to cast. The level 2 says whenever this class becomes level 2, return up to 1 target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. And at level 3, you can pay 1 generic, a white, and a blue, and at the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top card of your library. For as long as it remains exiled, you may cast this card from exile as long as you've cast another spell this turn. So, monks are all about double spelling, I guess. Overall, this looks like a nice card. Level 1 of this class isn't anything amazing, but it might help you double spell in the early game. Level 2 lets you bounce something, and that's something that I think really elevates this class card. It has the ability to actually interact with the opposing board. That will buy you more time to try to get to level 3, which you'll definitely want to do, because it will effectively start drawing you cards if you can double spell. Now, you won't always be able to do it, but this is actually really cheap to level up, and just drawing a couple cards off of it will make you feel pretty good about your situation. I think this is going to become an amazing value engine once you get to level 3, and I think it's pretty close to a bomb, but the setup is pretty real, so I'm going to keep it at B+. Next up, it's Orcus, Prince of Death, which for X, 2 generic, a black and a red, is a 5/3 legendary demon at rare. It has flying and trample, and when it enters the battlefield, you choose one. Each other creature gets -X until end of turn, you lose X life, or return up to X target creature cards with total mana value X or less from your graveyard. They gain haste until end of turn. So at worst, this is a 4 mana 5/3 with flying and trample. That's already a B because it's a cheap creature that puts your opponent on a very fast clock. So the option of pumping extra mana into him for additional effects is upside on an already impressive card. If you pay 7 and kill all the X2s on the board, or get back like a 2-drop to the battlefield, that's going to feel great. It just seems like at worst, you have a creature that pressures your opponent in the sky really effectively, and at best you have a card that can completely reshape the board in your favor. And yes, the -X part is symmetrical, but because you have complete control over it, you'll only use that when it's beneficial for you, and instead you'll choose the other option, making it feel a lot less symmetrical. I think this does everything you need a bomb to do, in that it's huge, it really reshapes the game, and if you're paying X, you're getting some value even if it dies, and I think all of that makes Orcus into an A+. Next up, it's Rogue class, which for a blue and a black is a rare enchantment class, and at level 1 it says, whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, exile the top card of that player's library face down. You may look at it for as long as it remains exiled. At level 2, which you can pay 1 generic, a blue, and a black to get to, it gives all your creatures menace. And then at level 3, which you can pay 2 generic and a blue and a black to get to, it says you may play cards exiled with Rogue class, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast those spells. The first level of this is pretty terrible. It effectively mills a card when your creatures hit your opponent and gives you a tiny bit of information. Level 2, giving your whole board menace, is pretty nice, and combined with level 1, could even present a problem of getting milled out for your opponent, though if all your creatures have menace and you're able to attack with them all over the place, you probably kill them before you mill them out, but it is a possibility. But level 3 is where the real value can be found here, as getting to cast cards you exiled with Rogue class is going to be quite powerful. The total mana investment is obviously huge, but paying it in installments softens that blow significantly. The card does ask you to have a pretty significant board presence to make it do a thing, and that's definitely a big limitation. I think this is a C+. Next up, it's Shesra, Death's Whisper, who for 2 generic, a black and a green, is a 1/3 legendary human elf warlock at uncommon, and when she enters the battlefield, target creature blocks this turn if able, and her other ability says at the beginning of your end step, if a creature died this turn, you may pay 2 life, and if you do, draw a card. So this is the signpost uncommon for black-green, a color pair that seems to be all about morbid effects. In other words, effects that give you some kind of value for a creature dying during your turn. This is a cool card. The idea is you play her and force an opposing creature to block one of your creatures, ideally killing that creature and keeping yours alive. Then at the end of the turn, you can pay 2 life to draw a card if that's what happened. Obviously, it doesn't have to line up perfectly for her to draw you cards and stuff. You can kill stuff on later turns and she can draw you cards, but what I just described is kind of what you want to happen. The problem I see, though, is that the enter the battlefield trigger won't matter a decent chunk of the time, so setting that first draw up is definitely not a foregone conclusion. She also has really bad stats for her cost. Still, in most games, she's likely to draw you a few cards, but I can't help but think she's a little bit less impressive than the other signpost uncommons we've seen. I'm giving her a C+. Next up, it's Skeletal Swarming, which for 3 generic, a black and a green is a rare enchantment, and it says each skeleton you control has trample, attacks each combat if able, and gets +X+0, where X is the number of other skeletons you control. At the beginning of your end step, you create a tapped 1/1 black skeleton creature token, and if a creature died this turn, create 2 of those tokens instead. This seems pretty good. This makes skeletons, and this set has a decent number of other skeletons in it that will also be able to get paid off by this card. One really nice thing about it is that you can tap out to play this on turn 5, and you still get to add to your board a little bit since you'll be getting that 1/1 skeleton. Do note that it comes into play tapped, so it won't actually be able to block, but you do add to your board somewhat. Then, once you have enough skeletons, they are going to be very capable of taking your opponent down thanks to trample and the big stats boost. One really nice thing about this card is it will give you 2 skeletons whether or not the creature that died during your turn is a token. This means you can have a sacrifice outlet that gobbles up 1 skeleton every turn and still net 1 skeleton every turn. There are a few sacrifice outlets in this set, including it common, so it's not a pipe dream. This card just seems like it will easily take over games, and the fact it's a value engine but also adds a creature to the board the turn you play it is a big deal for me. I think this is close to being a bomb, but it doesn't quite get there. The skeletons having to attack is a pretty big downside, so you can't sort of bide your time and wait for the skeletons to amass and then attack your opponent, but it still seems really good. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Sorcerer class, which for a blue and a red is an enchantment class at rare. Its level 1 says when it enters the battlefield, draw 2 cards and discard 2 cards. Its level 2, which you can get to for paying a blue and a red, says creatures you control have tap, add blue or red. Spend this mana only to cast an instant or sorcery spell or to gain a class level. And at level 3, for 3 generic, a blue and a red, you can get there. And it says whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, that spell deals damage to each opponent equal to the number of instant and sorcery spells you've cast this turn. Getting Faithless Looting for a blue and a red is a nice place to start here, as it will really help you find cards you want. Once you get this to level 2, things start to get more interesting, as you're given a whole bunch of mana, and you can use that mana to level it up to level 3. Sadly, level 3 won't be very impressive and limited, as casting more than like 2 instants and sorceries a turn is a pipe dream, even in the most spell-heavy decks. Mostly, this is about level 1 and 2 in Limited, and that seems like a fine card for most blue-red decks in the format. It might take a little bit of building around, but blue-red always has lots of spells, so I don't see that being a huge hurdle, especially because level 1 is kind of alright all on its own. I think you can first pick this in some weaker packs. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Targ Nar, Demon Fang Null, which for a red and a green is a 2/2 legendary null at uncommon. It has an ability called Pack Tactics, and this one is not just flavor text, flavor keyword ability. It's actually a recurring one that means the same thing on all the other cards we see with Pack Tactics, and what that means is if you're attacking with total power 6 or greater, you get some kind of effect. And in the case of Targ Nar, your attacking creatures get +1/+0 until end of turn. He also has an activated ability where you can pay 2 generic, a red, and a green to double his power and toughness until end of turn. And yeah, this is the signpost common for red-green, which is all about Pack Tactics. Targ comes with his own Pack Tactics ability, and it's one that is pretty nice, though not incredible. However, because he has the ability to double his own power, he can make Pack Tactics happen pretty easily, and him attacking with just a couple of other creatures can be a real problem. This is another pretty good signpost uncommon, and one you'll take early sometimes. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, we have Tiamat, which for 2 generic mana and 1 of each colored mana, Wooburg, is a legendary creature dragon god at Mythic Rare. It's a 7/7 with flying, and when it enters the battlefield, if you cast it, search your library for up to 5 dragon cards not named Tiamat that each have different names, reveal them, put them into your hand, and then shuffle. The cost here is pretty rough, being Wooburg and all that, but it is a 7-mana 7/7 that will usually be able to draw you at least 1 card, and that card will be another dragon. The mana cost definitely holds it back some, but if you end up with a good mana base that can actually make this happen, Tiamat will feel like a bomb. This is probably going to be the most doable in red-black because you have access to the most treasure in that color pair. However, thanks to that mana cost, you really can't be valuing this the same way you would a monocolored or 2-colored bomb. As a result, I don't give it the A grade that a bomb gets, even though it will feel like that when you play it, and that's because my grades are more about how highly you should consider taking cards. Still, the upside is very real, and if this format ends up having even better mana than I expect, it may just be an A, but for now, I think it's just a B. Next up, it's Trelasara Moondancer, which for a green and a white is a 2/2 elf cleric at uncommon, and it says whenever you gain life, put a +1/+1 counter on Trelasara and scry 1. This is another really nice signpost uncommon. Green-white is all about gaining life. If you've ever played with a Johnny's Pridemate, you know what this effect can do, and this trigger is even better than a Johnny's Pridemate's. Adding Scry can help you find more ways to gain life too to keep the party going. This is going to be another high pick as a signpost uncommon, giving it a B. Next up, it's Triumphant Adventurer, which for a white and a black is a 1/1 human knight at rare. It's got Death Touch, and as long as it's your turn, it has First Strike, and whenever it attacks, you venture into a dungeon. This guy's definitely small, but the combination of Death Touch and First Strike when it attacks is going to be pretty great, especially because he ventures for you every single time he attacks, and that will get you through a dungeon in a hurry. Even if your opponent does take it down in combat, they're going to have to give up at least one thing, and sometimes your opponent will be able to double block and kill it, but you're still getting a good deal. Backing it up with combat tricks will be nasty too, because obviously First Strike and Death Touch plus 2 or more power means you can take down both blockers and keep the adventurer alive. He does die to pretty much everything, but his ability to venture repeatedly is too good to pass up. I'm giving him a B. Next up, it's Volo, Guide to Monsters, which for 2 generic, a green and a blue, is a 3/2 human wizard at rare. It's legendary, and whenever you cast a creature spell that doesn't share a creature type with a creature you control or a creature card in your graveyard, you copy that spell, and that means a creature spell copy is a creature token. So this might look like it's kind of hard to make work because of the requirements, but I think it will be relatively easy to trigger this at least once. There are a plethora of creature types in this format, and while you will ideally have a good mix of them to make Volo work, you probably don't have to work that hard to do it. You really only need to get one copy out of him for it to feel like you're getting there, and anything more than that will probably be enough to put you comfortably in the lead, giving him a B. And our last multicolored card before we move ahead with white is Xanathar Guild Kingpin, which for 4 generic, a blue and a black, is a 5/6 legendary beholder at mythic rare. And at the beginning of your upkeep, you choose an opponent, and until end of turn, that player can't cast spells. You may look at the top card of their library anytime, you may play the top card of their library, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast spells this way. Obviously, this is a bomb. Shutting off the opponent's spells during your turn isn't an incredible effect in Limited, though it does matter. Xanathar's power really comes from the ability to just play cards from your opponent's library, though. Note, by the way, it says play, which means it includes lands. So if there's a land on top, you can play it with your land drop for the turn and hopefully hit something better. In other words, you're going to get serious value out of Xanathar every single turn. It does have medium stats, and you have to wait until your next upkeep to reap the rewards of its ability, but it's still an amazing bomb. I'm giving it an A. So those are all the multicolored cards. Let's move ahead now with white, where our first card is +2 Mace, which for 1 generic and a white is an artifact equipment at common. An equipped creature gets +2/+2, and the equip cost is 3. This gives an alright boost for the mana it costs to play and equip, but it will probably get cut a little more often than it gets played. It's just a little too clunky to be more than a C-, and that's even true with there being an equipment deck around, though obviously it goes up a little bit in that deck. Next up, it's Arborea Pegasus, which for 3 generic and a white is a 2/3 Pegasus at common. It's got flying, and when it enters the battlefield, target creature gets +1/+1 and gains flying until end of turn. This is a nice common. The enter the battlefield trigger will almost always enable an attack you didn't have before, and that means the Pegasus has an immediate impact on the board, in addition to bringing a 4-mana 2/3 flying body to the table. I think this is a C+. Next up, it's Blink Dog, which for 2 generic and a white is a 1/1 dog. At uncommon, it's got double strike, and you can pay 3 generic and a white to have it phase out. That's right, phasing is back. It is a weird mechanic, so if you're not familiar with it, make sure you understand all the rules, but in short, you basically act like whatever has phased out doesn't exist on the battlefield, but it's not the same as a card blinking. So it's not like it leaves the battlefield or enters the battlefield again. It just ceases existing on the battlefield and then comes back. So again, kind of a weird ability, but that is how it works. Overall, Blink Dog does not look very good. 3 mana for a 1/1 with double strike is rough, and the phase effect is cool, but also costly. I guess if you have some equipment, he can be interesting because of the double strike, but I think you mostly just won't play this. He's too expensive to play, and his ability's too expensive too. I'm giving him a D+. Next up, it's the Book of Exalted Deeds, which for 3 white mana is a legendary artifact at mythic rare, and it says at the beginning of your end step, if you gain 3 or more life this turn, create a 3/3 white angel creature token with flying. It also has an activated ability where you can pay 3 white, tap it, and exile it to put an enlightened counter on target angel, and it gains you can't lose the game, and your opponent can't win the game. Activate only as a sorcery. We'll see some more of this cycle throughout the week, and most of them don't seem that great in Limited because they're so all in on really specific strategies, so it seems like they would fit really well if you get all the best synergies possible, but doing that just won't happen enough. The book does have the bonus of overlapping with the green-white archetype, which we've seen was about gaining life, but the fact that this makes you gain 3 or more life is a pretty huge requirement. You really need to be making lots of angels with this thing for it to ever be worth it, and the mana cost is actually pretty challenging in your typical limited deck, and you really want to get this down before you start gaining life, but doing that won't be easy. The ability can be used on any angel, and sometimes that might be worth doing, but again, you really need to be getting angel tokens out of this, at least one, for it to really feel worth it. I think we have to go with a build-around grade here because even the green-white deck will be gaining like 1 and 2 life sometimes and just unable to trigger this, so even that deck won't always be able to play the Book of Exalted Deeds really effectively. So I think it's probably like a D+ in your typical white deck in the format, but if you can get there as much as possible on gaining life, it's probably like a B. I have a hard time seeing a ceiling above that just because having enough life gain to really make this go crazy seems challenging. Next up, it's Celestial Unicorn, which for 2 generic and a white is a 3/2 unicorn at common, and whenever you gain life, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. As we've seen, green-white is the color pair interested in gaining life, and this is a nice common payoff for that kind of deck. And it can be pretty solid in other decks too, as it isn't like green-white is the only deck where you'll be able to gain life. This can get big fast, and is a reasonable starting point as a 3-mana 3/2. It seems like a pretty good common. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Cleric class, which for 1 white mana is an uncommon enchantment. Its level 1 says if you would gain life, you gain that much life +1 instead. Its level 2, which takes 3 generic and a white to get there, says whenever you gain life, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. And its level 3, which costs 4 generic and a white, says when this class becomes level 3, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. You gain life equal to its toughness. Level 1 of this class, like most of them, probably wouldn't be worth playing, but I think the next 2 abilities on this one are pretty potent. Level 2 gives you an Ajani's Pridemate effect, which is great if you have some life gain, and level 3 lets you reanimate a creature and gain some life, which will also mean you put a counter somewhere. The total package here is pretty appealing, but probably still a pretty serious build-around. It has a kind of reasonable floor, as most decks can take advantage of the reanimation, but it's probably like a C- in your typical white deck, and probably a B, maybe a B+ in a green-white deck that is good at gaining life. Next up, it's Cloister Gargoyle, which for 2 generic and a white is a 0/4 artifact creature gargoyle at uncommon, and when it enters the battlefield, you venture into the dungeon, and as long as you've completed a dungeon, it gets +3/+0 and has flying. A 3-mana 0/4 that ventures into the dungeon is probably already a decent card for the format, but this looks to be one of the bigger payoffs for completing dungeons at lower rarities, as it becoming a 3/4 flyer is a pretty big deal. That kind of size almost always matters on an evasive creature, and it's going to give you some value when it enters the battlefield no matter what. Overall, this seems like a pretty good uncommon, though perhaps not quite first pickable. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Dancing Sword, which for 1 generic and a white is a rare artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +2/+1, and when the equipped creature dies, you can have Dancing Sword become a 2/1 construct artifact creature with flying in Ward 1. If you do, it isn't an equipment, and it has an equip cost of 1. So, if this were just 1 and a white for an equipment that equipped for only 1 mana and gave +2/+1, I would already be on board. That's a great boost for the cost. Obviously, the added bonus is that it can become a 2/1 flyer when that's something you need more. A +2/+1 boost can eventually get outclassed, especially if you don't have evasive creatures, so the sword's ability to just turn into one will definitely come up, though I think a lot of the time you might prefer to keep this as an equipment. Either way, this is a very good card. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Dawnbringer Cleric, which for 1 generic and a white is a 1/3 human cleric at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you have 3 options. You can gain 2 life, you can destroy an enchantment, or you can exile a card from a graveyard. None of these effects are amazing, but the flexibility this card offers is nice. Mostly, you'll gain 2 life with it, which will be okay-ish, but when you have an enchantment to destroy or a key card to remove from your opponent's graveyard, it's going to feel great. Gaining life, of course, also matters some in this set, so there's some synergy to be had. I think this is a solid playable. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Delver's Torch, which for 1 generic and a white is a common artifact equipment. It says equipped creature gets +1/+1. Whenever equipped creature attacks, you venture into the dungeon, and the equip cost is 3 generic mana. The cost of playing this and equipping it is pretty high for only a +1/+1 stat boost. Venturing every time the creature attacks is where the real value is, but as high as I am on Venture, I'm not a huge fan of this card. It doesn't do a whole lot to help one of your creatures attack that couldn't already attack before, and I think that's the big thing you want equipment to do for you. And +1/+1 just won't do it, especially when you're doing it for 3 mana, and that won't feel great. If you already have evasive creatures or a big creature, it could be nice because it can get you venturing a lot. But yeah, I think this is a little clunky and underwhelming overall. I'm going to give it a C-. Next up, it's Devoted Paladin, which for 4 generic and a white is a 4/4 Orc Knight at common, and when it enters the battlefield, creatures you control get +1/+1 and gain Vigilance until end of turn. This is really good and definitely a contender for white's best common. Pumping your whole board and giving it Vigilance almost always seems to allow for some serious attacking on your part. After all, your creatures are bigger, and you're going to be able to leave them all back as blockers, even if you're going to attack with them. We've seen similar cards like Dawnfeather Eagle end up great in Limited, and this format does look like it has the means to go wide effectively, especially in red-white, and if that's true, the Paladin is going to be one of the cards you want the most to round out the top of your curve, and one of white's best commons. I think it's a B. Next up, it's Divine Smite, which for 1 generic and a white is an uncommon instant. It says target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls phases out. If that permanent is black, exile it instead. So there's a whole cycle of color hosers in this set, and most of them do something that is pretty good to any type of creature or planeswalker, and something incredibly efficient to one in the enemy color. And that's what we have here, sort of. I think it might be the worst in the cycle. Phasing something out just isn't that good. It's sort of like bouncing a creature, except it's worse in the sense that your opponent doesn't have to pay mana again to get their creature back. It will just come back on its own. In that sense, it's more like tapping a creature down for 1 turn. You also can't use it on your own creature to save it from removal or something like that. You can only target the opponent's stuff. Still, it does kind of a reasonable thing against all creatures or planeswalkers, and will be insane against black creatures or planeswalkers. And I think that if this was just the phasing side, you probably wouldn't play it, but you will run into people playing black often enough that it's going to be at least a solid playable, and obviously against them it'll feel way better than a C, feel kind of like a D against people who have no black at all, but the upside is real. Next up, it's Dragon's Disciple, which for 1 generic and a white is a 1/3 human monk at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, you may reveal a dragon card from your hand, if you do, or if you control a dragon, it enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it, and dragons you control have Ward 1. This is a nice dragon payoff, as being able to play this as a 2-mana 2/4 will feel pretty great, especially on turn 2. Adding Ward 1 to all your dragons isn't bad either. The fact that this has a fail case of being a 2-mana 1/3 means it has a not entirely terrible floor. There are enough dragons around in this set for you to be able to take full advantage of this some of the time, but sometimes it really will just be that 1/3, and that's not going to feel awesome. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Dwarfhold Champion, which for 1 generic and a white is a 3/1 Dwarf Warrior at common, and when it's equipped, it gets +0/+2. A 2-mana 3/1 tends to be a reasonable baseline for aggro decks, and this comes with some decent additional upside. Gaining toughness when you equip it will feel pretty nice, as obviously a 3/1 is pretty vulnerable. This seems solid. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Flumph, which for 1 generic and a white is a 0/4 Jellyfish at rare. It's got Defender and Flying, and when it's dealt damage, you and target opponent each draw a card. This definitely has a strange design, but I think overall it seems fine. Symmetrical card draw kind of just leaves you and your opponent at parity, and in the meantime you can block a whole lot of stuff. Obviously, if you're blocking something they're attacking with, they're probably going to take advantage of their new card before you can, but I still think overall you're just sort of netting a decent 0/4 blocker, and, digging through your deck is nice. Your opponent digging through theirs isn't great either, but because you're both drawing cards, I don't see this as terrible. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Gloomstalker, which for 2 generic and a white is a 2/3 Dwarf Ranger at common, and as long as you've completed a dungeon, it has Double Strike. This is very mediocre if you haven't completed a dungeon, and if you have, it will feel pretty nice, but not incredible. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Grandmaster of Flowers, which for 2 generic and 2 white is a legendary Planeswalker Bahamut at Mythic Rare. It starts with 3 loyalty, has a static ability that says as long as Grandmaster of Flowers has 7 or more loyalty counters on him, he's a 7/7 Dragon God creature with flying and indestructible. He has a +1 that says target creature without First Strike, Double Strike, or Vigilance can't attack or block until your next turn. He's got another +1 that says search your library and or graveyard for a card named Monk of the Open Hand, reveal it and put it into your hand. If you search your library this way, shuffle. I don't think this is quite the kind of Planeswalker that will take over games with ease, but it still seems pretty good. His first +1 is where you'll get the most bang for your buck, as making most creatures unable to attack or block can have a big impact on the game, and can allow the Grandmaster to protect itself. Now, he can't stop creatures with some pretty common keyword abilities, but that's okay. He will stop most things. His other +1 is only going to be useful if you've also drafted Monk of the Open Hand, which we'll see later in this video. It's an uncommon and a pretty solid 1-drop, but you aren't really guaranteed to get one in your draft, so that effect will be useless sometimes. If you can get a Monk or two, that other +1 will feel good while you can use it, as you get a body to protect the Grandmaster. Obviously, the big goal here is to get the Grandmaster up to 7 loyalty, at which point he becomes a huge, indestructible dragon. But making that happen won't be that easy. It will take 4 turns to get there, and while he can protect himself some, he's not so good that it will be easy to make that happen. Now, your opponent will want to commit significant resources to keeping his loyalty from getting that high, and that will give you some value, and that's probably normally what's going to happen. He's going to slow your opponent down with his +1 abilities and eventually get killed, but the amount of value you get out of your opponent having to spend resources on killing the Grandmaster could be enough for you to win the game. All in all, I don't think he's a bomb planeswalker, merely a really good one. I'm giving him a B. Next up, it's Guardian of Faith, which for 1 generic and 2 white is a 3/2 Spirit Knight at rare. It's got Flash and Vigilance, and when it enters the battlefield, any number of other target creatures you control phase out. I think this looks pretty good. At worst, you have a 3-mana 3/2 with Flash and Vigilance, which is something that would always make the cut, and the Enter the Battlefield phasing ability can be used in a variety of effective ways. You can use it to save a creature from removal, or set up a block that would have been a chump and then flash this in to keep the creature around. There won't always be situations where you can actually do something with this, as sometimes the board just won't be where it needs to be for that to happen, but because it has a reasonable fail case and a pretty high ceiling, I think you can value this pretty highly. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Half-Elf Monk, which for 3 generic and a white is a 1/4 Human Elf Monk. At common, it's got Vigilance, and you can pay 1 generic and a white to tap target creature. Master Decoy effects still tend to be pretty good and limited. Tapping down your opponent's best creature every turn often just feels like removal, and this has the minor added bonus of being able to attack and still use the ability. I say minor because it is only a 1/4, so that's not exactly incredible. Still, this is a pretty nice common for white. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Icing Death Frost Tyrant. For 2 generic and 2 white, you get a 4/3 legendary creature dragon at Mythic rare. It's got flying and vigilance, and when it dies, you create a legendary white equipment artifact token with equipped creature gets +2/+0, and whenever equipped creature attacks, tap target creature defending player controls, and it has an equip cost of 2. This is a stone cold bomb. It starts out life as a really problematic creature for your opponent. A 4-mana 4/3 with flying and vigilance will rapidly kill your opponent if they don't do something, but what really pushes this into bomb rage is that even if they can do something, you end up with a really good equipment anyway. The stats boost and the ability to tap down blockers will put your opponent in a ton of trouble, and it's the kind of boost that just makes any creature into a threat. This is an A+. Next up, it's Ingenious Smith, which for 1 generic and a white is a 1/1 Human Artificer at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, you look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal an artifact card from among them and put it into your hand. Whenever 1 or more artifacts enter the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on Ingenious Smith. This ability triggers only once each turn. This set has a decent number of artifacts in it, so the Enter the Battlefield ability will probably draw you a card like half the time in a typical white deck. The other part of the card, however, counts treasure, and while treasure is more concentrated in other colors than it is in white, it is all over the place in this set, so it growing from treasure is a very real possibility. I think this is a C+. Next up, we have Keen-Eared Sentry, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/1 Human Soldier at uncommon. It says you have hexproof, and each opponent can't venture into the dungeon more than once each turn. This doesn't seem great. Giving yourself hexproof won't matter very often, and while people can venture more than once a turn sometimes, that's not going to be a really common occurrence. Maybe this is here to help provide some dungeon hate for Constructed, where venturing more than once a turn will happen sometimes, but in Limited it's going to happen only so often, and not enough for you to want to play this mediocre 2-drop. It does have an okay baseline, so it isn't terrible, but its text box won't matter that often, giving it a C-. Next up, it's Loyal Warhound, which for 1 generic and a white is a 3/1 dog at rare. It's got vigilance, and when it enters the battlefield, if an opponent controls more lands than you, search your library for a basic plains card, put it on the battlefield tapped, and shuffle. A 2-mana 3/1 with vigilance is a nice baseline, and the fact this also can ramp you sometimes is awesome. If you're on the draw, it really won't be that hard to get that part of the card to trigger, and if you're missing land drops, this guy can really come to the rescue. I'm giving him a B-. Next up, it's Minimus Containment, which for 2 generic and a white is a common aura. It says enchant non-land permanent, and it says enchanted permanent is a treasure artifact with tap, sacrifice this artifact, add 1 mana of any color, and it loses all other abilities. This is a pretty neat take on white's usually enchantment-based removal spell. So the idea is that you use this on an opposing permanent that's a problem, but there's some downside in that your opponent gets a treasure. The good news about that is that by the late game, the downside will become increasingly negligible, and even in the mid game, this will often just be well worth doing. I'm not sure I would really recommend using this on like turn 3. It will probably be a net gain for you overall, but the mana you give your opponent early can really come back to bite you. This is still premium removal though, especially because it deals with all non-lands. In a pinch, you can also put it on your own permanent if you really need a specific color of mana, but that's almost never going to be the right thing to do. This is another contender for white's best common. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Monk of the Open Hand, which the Grandmaster of Flowers can search up that we saw earlier. It's 1 white mana for a 1/1 elf monk at uncommon, and whenever you cast your second spell each turn, you put a +1/+1 counter on Monk of the Open Hand. This card reminds me a lot of the black-white double spell deck from Kaldheim. If you can get your curve low enough, this guy can grow relatively quickly, and without you having to commit significant resources. It does look like a low-curve aggro deck is a thing in this format too, especially in red-white, so I can see this being a nice fit there. It takes some work to make the monk worth playing if you don't have the Grandmaster, but if you find yourself with a low curve, this might be a nice fit. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Moon Blessed Cleric, which for 2 generic and a white is a 3/2 human elf cleric at uncommon, and when it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for an enchantment card, reveal it, then shuffle and put that card on top. This does a pretty good Heliod's Pilgrim impression. It can't tutor the card right to your hand, but it does let you get any kind of enchantment and not just an aura, and it also comes with better stats for the cost, so I think it will end up playing very similarly to the Pilgrim, who tends to be a pretty nice card to have in most limited formats. Obviously, you need some enchantments to get it going, but that's not a difficult hurdle. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Nadar, Selfless Paladin, who for 2 generic and a white is a 3/3 legendary Dragon Knight at rare. It's got Vigilance, and when it enters the battlefield or attacks, you venture into the dungeon, and other creatures you control get +1/+1 as long as you've completed a dungeon. A 3-mana 3/3 with Vigilance is a great place to start, and doing dungeon stuff every time it enters the battlefield or attacks is incredibly good, and that would be true even if he didn't also give you a massive bonus for having a dungeon completed. Between Nadar and other dungeon cards, it isn't super far-fetched that you can get the Anthem effect here, especially because, as we've seen, one of the dungeons only takes 3 ventures to be completed, and the other one can take 4, and Nadar can do half of that on his own between his Enter the Battlefield ability and his first attack. I think Nadar does enough to get into the lower bomb range, giving him an A-. Next up, it's Oswald Fiddlebender, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/2 Gnome Artificer at rare. It's legendary, and you can pay 1 and tap it and sacrifice an artifact to search your library for an artifact card with mana value equal to 1 plus the sacrificed artifact's mana value, put it onto the battlefield, and then shuffle. Activate only as a sorcery. So, these types of abilities are tough to make work in Limited. They can shine in Constructed because you can make your deck so that it can really effectively utilize it, but in Limited, you'll be dependent on the draft going just the right way for that ability to be useful, and even then, it might not be worth it. The good news is, it has a baseline as a 2-mana 2/2, and even if you just end up with like 1 2-mana and 1 3-mana artifact in your deck, the ability might come up sometimes. This seems like it will get cut a lot though, as just a straight up bear isn't what it used to be, but it has a decent enough fail case. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Paladin class, which for 1 white mana is an enchantment class at rare. At level 1, it says spells your opponent casts during your turn cost 1 more to cast. Level 2 lets you pay 2 generic and a white to get there, and creatures you control get +1/+1, so an Anthem. And level 3 lets you pay 4 generic and a white and says whenever you attack until end of turn, target attacking creature gets +1/+1 for each other attacking creature and gains double strike. This seems like a really nice class enchantment. The base of the card isn't awesome, but once you get up to the second level, you've paid 4 mana for an Anthem and attacks on your opponent's spells during your turn, and I think that would probably be a card you always played. And this has the upside of letting you pay that 4 mana in installments, as well as the fact it can go to level 3, at which point it will make one of your creatures into a really frightening attacker every single turn. I think this is a lot less situational than some of the other classes, as it will be a nice fit in any white deck with a reasonable number of creatures. I think this class enchantment is a bomb. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Paladin Shield, which for 1 generic and a white is a common artifact equipment with flash. When it enters the battlefield, you attach it to target creature you control. That creature gets +0/+2, and it has an equip cost of 3. We've seen equipment like this before, and I've never really been impressed by it. A boosted toughness alone is very rarely something you're after in your equipment, and while this does have flash, so you can use it as sort of a combat trick, it will usually only ever save your creature and not really help it win combat. Then, after you get to attach it for free that one time, the equip cost is really high for what this is. Red-white decks do have an equipment sub-theme, and that helps it out a little bit, but I don't think it's enough to make this be something you play regularly, giving it a D. Next up, it's Planar Ally, which for 3 generic and 2 white is a 3/3 angel at common. It's got flying, and when it attacks, you venture into the dungeon. We've seen a lot of 5 mana 3/3 flyers of late that have some ability, and they've all been pretty nice cards for limited, and I think we have another one of those here. Venturing with every attack is great, as the ally, left unchecked, will be able to get you through dungeons all on its own. This format does have more large flyers than usual, as a result of the heavy dragon sub-theme, so this may find itself unable to attack effectively more than it would in most formats, but I think this is another really good common for white, giving it a B. Next up, it's Plate Armor, which for 2 generic and a white is an artifact equipment at uncommon. The equipped creature gets +3/+3 and has ward 1. It has an equip cost of 3, but it costs 1 less to activate for each other equipment you control. This seems like pretty nice equipment. 3 to play and 3 to equip is a little costly, but the good news is that whatever you put this on is going to become a problem, as +3/+3 is enough to make virtually any creature a lot scarier. Ward 1 is nice too, as it makes the amount of mana you spend on this hurt a little less when they do kill your creature. Sometimes you'll be able to equip it for less, especially in red-white, which, as we've seen, really likes equipment. I think this is a C+. Next up, it's Portable Hole, which for 1 white mana is an uncommon artifact, and when it enters the battlefield, you exile target non-land permanent an opponent controls with mana value 2 or less until Portable Hole leaves the battlefield. This will feel pretty good to use on a 2-drop permanent, as you will come out ahead mana-wise, and it will prevent death triggers and stuff like that. Importantly, it can also exile all of the class enchantments, and that will come up. However, just being able to hit 2 and 1 mana permanents is a liability, and this isn't even close to being premium removal, or a card you'll even always play. I think it's just a C. Next up, it's Potion of Healing, which for 1 generic and a white is a common artifact. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card, and you can pay 1 white and tap it, and sacrifice it to gain 3 life. Most of the time we see this kind of effect on a spell, and it costs 1 fewer total mana than Potion of Healing does to draw you a card and gain you some life. This lets you pay it in installments, and it is nice that you can just play it to draw the card and hold on to the life gain for a little bit later, like when you have life gain synergies. Still, the card seems pretty replaceable, just like Revitalize and similar cards we've seen. You'll probably cut it more than you play it. I think it's a C-. Next up, it's Priest of Ancient Lore, which for 2 generic and a white is a 2/1 dwarf cleric at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you gain 1 life and draw a card. This is another nice common for white. People are always complaining white doesn't have enough card draw, so getting an Enter the Battlefield ability like this will make those people happy. In limited, this will be a 2-for-1 a lot of the time, and the fact that it gains you that 1 life is not a small thing either, since green-white is all about gaining life. I think you can first pick this in some weaker packs. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Rally Maneuver, which for 2 generic and a white is an uncommon instant, and it says target creature gets +2/+0 and gains first strike until end of turn, up to 1 other target creature gets +0/+2 and gains lifelink until end of turn. This is an interesting trick. You typically want to be spending only 1 or 2 mana on tricks, but when they start being able to target multiple creatures, I get a little more interested in more expensive ones too, since they at least have the possibility of creating 2-for-1s. This would obviously be better if it just gave +2/+0 and first strike to 2 things, but there will be situations where this lines up pretty nicely, allowing 2 of your creatures to win combat while also gaining you some life. It is sort of unfortunate that it requires you to target 2 separate creatures, but this still seems pretty solid as far as tricks go. The first copy seems like it will be a pretty good one in white aggressive decks. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Ranger's Hawk, which for 1 white mana is a 1/1 bird at common. It's got flying, you can pay 3 and tap it and another untapped creature you control to venture into the dungeon, activate only as a sorcery. 1 mana 1/1 flyers are almost never that great in limited unless they have something else worthwhile going on, and the good news for the Hawk is that it does. In the early game, it can attack a bit in the air, it's also a good place to put equipment, but it will quickly be forced to stop attacking. Luckily, it has a late game mana sink that seems pretty good. Venturing into dungeons every turn will definitely allow you to grind out some wins late. Now, the cost of doing it isn't small. Having to have another untapped creature isn't a guarantee, and because it's only sorcery speed, this means you're making yourself vulnerable to an opposing attack. But if you're at parity or ahead of your opponent, it won't be that hard to make it happen. I think this is a C. Next up, it's Steadfast Paladin, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/2 Dwarf Knight at common, and it's got lifelink. We've seen a lot of 2-mana 2/2s with lifelink lately, and they tend to be solid enough and limited, especially in a format with a life gain archetype. It will wield equipment pretty effectively too. I think this is a C+. Next up, it's Teleportation Circle, which for 3 generic and a white is a rare enchantment, and it says at the beginning of your end step, exile up to 1 target artifact or creature you control, then return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control. This is a build-around. This kind of effect just doesn't matter if you don't have the right deck for it. Just getting pseudo-vigilance out of it isn't worth it. The good news is that both black-white and blue-white look like they are in a reasonably good position to make use of this, and when you can get some kind of into the battlefield trigger every turn out of this, it will feel great, especially if it involves venturing into dungeons. But still, I don't think your average deck in the format will be able to put this to use. It's probably a D there. However, if your deck is in a good position to make this an engine, it's probably a B. Next up, it's Veteran Dungeoneer, which for 3 generic and a white is a 3/4 human warrior at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you venture into the dungeon. This seems like another really good common for white. Venturing isn't quite drawing a card most of the time, but it gives you value that isn't that far away from drawing a card, almost no matter where you are in the dungeon, and if this was a 4-mana 3/4 that drew you a card, it would probably be a B at worst. 2-for-1s are a big deal, and again, this won't quite feel like a 2-for-1 all the time, but it does do a lot for the mana cost, and enough to be another really good common for white, and one you'll first pick sometimes, giving it a B-. Next up, it's White Dragon, which for 4 generic and 2 white is a 4/4 dragon. At uncommon, it's got flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you tap target creature an opponent controls. That creature doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. This is really good. If you know me, you know I love enter the battlefield effects like this one. Adding a creature to the battlefield while also hampering your opponent's side of the table for a full turn is pretty serious, especially when that creature is a 4/4 flyer. This just will give you all kinds of tempo and can really swing the game in your favor, which is a great thing for an uncommon to be capable of. I think this might be the best card in this uncommon dragon cycle. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's You Hear Something on Watch, which for 1 generic and a white is a common instant, and it says choose one. Creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn, or this spell deals 5 damage to target attacking creature. This is another nice common, maybe not as good as some of the others we've seen. The removal effect only works on attackers, so if you're beat down, it won't feel great. But the good news is if you are the beatdown, you're probably interested in the other mode since it pays you off pretty well for going wide. The removal is too situational to be premium, but it will kill lots of attackers, and having the board pump effect as an option is pretty nice, giving this a C+. Next, it's You're Ambushed on the Road, which for 1 white mana is a common instant, and it says choose one. Return target creature you control to its owner's hand, or target creature gets +1/+3 until end of turn. So, neither of these cards individually would be very good. They'd be things you basically never played. But the final product is definitely greater than the sum of its parts here. White-blue especially is interested in bouncing its own creatures to retrigger into the battlefield abilities, so that part of the card will come up in ways other than just to save a creature from removal. The trick part is mediocre, but also sometimes useful. Each card would individually be a D at best, but together, I think the options this card gives you are good enough for a C-. Alright, well that is our last white card in Dungeons & Dragons Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. We're going to wrap this video up now by looking at the colorless cards. In other words, the colorless artifacts and the lands. First up, we have Bag of Holding, which for 1 generic mana is an uncommon artifact, and whenever you discard a card, you exile that card from your graveyard. You can pay 2 generic and tap it to loot, in other words, draw a card, then discard a card, and you can pay 4 and tap it and sacrifice it to return all cards exiled with it to their owner's hand. This was a predictable reprint given the theme of the set. Last time we saw it, it was a rare, and it was a pretty decent card. Having a card that just lets you sink mana into it to loot is itself a nice thing to have around, and the fact that you can eventually get back the stuff that you do loot is nice upside, though it is a little slow and it won't come up that often. It still doesn't have any real board presence, so it isn't nearly as good as a creature who can loot for you, but it's solid enough. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's the Deck of Many Things, which costs 5 generic mana, and it's a mythic rare legendary artifact, and you can pay 2 and tap it, and you roll a d20 and subtract the number of cards in your hand from it. If the result is 0 or less, you discard your hand. If you get 1 through 9 as the final product, you get a card at random from your graveyard to your hand. If you roll 10 through 19, you draw 2 cards, and if you get to 20, you put a creature card from any graveyard onto the battlefield under your control, and when that creature dies, its owner loses the game. So like most of the D20 cards, especially the ones at higher rarity, this thing is pretty wacky, and it's also kind of funny to see, cards on a Magic card itself. But anyway, this has a repeatable effect that will often be quite good at grinding out a win. You will typically draw 2 cards with it or return something random from your graveyard, and doing that every turn is pretty potent. And while, if you have too many cards, it will be harder to draw more, by the time of the game where a card like this tends to be good, you're probably not going to have much of a hand, so rolling higher numbers isn't going to be that difficult. It definitely is a slow card, but will be good enough in the later part of the game to take pretty highly. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Dungeon Map, which for 3 generic mana is an uncommon artifact. You can tap it for colorless mana, and you can pay 3 and tap it to venture into a dungeon, activate only as a sorcery. This provides a bit of ramp, and then, in the later part of the game, it's a great place to sink your mana, as venturing every turn is some nice value. If this format is super fast, playing this in turn 3 could be a liability, and the late game value won't matter, but if this is a typical format, I can see this being a pretty nice card in most decks that aren't super aggressive, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Eye of Vecna, which for 2 generic mana is a legendary artifact at rare, and when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card, and you lose 2 life. At the beginning of your upkeep, you can pay 2 generic mana, and if you do, you draw a card, and you lose 2 life. This costs a fair bit of life, but drawing cards is always really nice and limited, as significantly outcarding your opponent usually leads to victory. The fact it draws you a card right away is nice, and then, if you have the life, time, and mana, you can use it to draw more cards later. This might be the most well-positioned in the green-white deck, which has the most life gain in the format, but I think it will be pretty good in any deck. It also has some very minor upside because of a mythic rare legendary artifact in black that involves Vecna, but that's almost never going to come up because the 3 cards involved are mythic rare and 2 rares. But it matters a tiny, tiny bit. Either way, I think this is a pretty good card. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's 50 Feet of Rope, which for 1 colorless mana is an uncommon artifact, and you can tap it to make a wall unable to block, or you can pay 3 and tap it to make target creature not untap during its controller's next untap step, or you can pay 4 and tap it to venture into the dungeon. Well, this is pretty cool, has nice modal effects, and it's certainly flavorful, but Climb Over won't matter that much. There are a few walls in the set, but not many of them. And the tie up effect is perhaps a little too situational too, because it doesn't tap the creature as part of the effect. It will only do a thing against creatures that are already tapped. The part of the card that intrigues me the most, though, is venturing into the dungeon. And that is a little clunky, but it is obviously a good late game mana sink. The first 2 modes will be hard to make use of early or even late, and the venture into the dungeon option is pretty good late. But I can see this sitting on the table doing very little early, and that is kind of rough. This is definitely the kind of card it's easy to miss on because it is both unusual and utilizes a new mechanic, but for now I think it's a C. Next up, it's Great Axe, which for 1 generic mana is an artifact equipment at common. It says equipped creature gets +4/+0, and it has equip 5. +4/+0 is the kind of boost that makes almost any creature capable of attacking, but an equip cost of 5 is way too much. This equipment might be nice in the later part of the game, since you can just keep sending your guys in, but it will sit on the table doing nothing the rest of the game. I think this is a D+. Next up, it's Hand of Vecna, which for 3 generic mana is a rare legendary artifact equipment. It says at the beginning of combat on your turn, equipped creature or a creature you control named Vecna gets +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of cards in your hand. It has an equip cost that says pay 1 life for each card in your hand, and it has another equip cost that is just 2 generic mana. This looks pretty good. Sure, you need to have cards in your hand for it to pump your creature, but you'll basically always have at least 1 card in your hand, so it will give +1/+1 most of the time, at least on your turn, and that also means it will be very cheap to equip, sometimes costing 1 life or 0 life. The flip side is that if your hand is loaded with cards, it will make your creature huge, but then you can just pay the equip cost the normal way, and it'll be awesome. Either way, you end up with an equipment that is reasonably efficient and does good stuff pretty much all game long. I think it's a B. Next up, it's Iron Golem, which for 4 generic is a 5/3 artifact creature golem at uncommon. It's got vigilance, and it attacks or blocks each combat if able. This is kind of like Juggernaut, a card that's still pretty okay and limited. It is a bit of a bummer that they didn't give this can't be blocked by walls, since there are a few of them in this set, but either way, this is a nice little artifact creature. It's sure to die in combat because it has to block and attack constantly, but it has high enough power that will kill most stuff at least, giving it a C. Next up, it's Leather Armor, which for 1 generic is an artifact equipment at common. It says equipped creature gets +0/+1 and has ward 1. It has an equip cost of 0, but you can only activate it once each turn. This probably isn't really worth playing. It's cool that it equips for free once a turn, but the bonus it gives is negligible enough to not be worth a card in most scenarios. If you end up with a deck with a crazy amount of equipment payoffs, which could happen in red-white, maybe you end up playing it, but that's probably the only time you do. I'm giving this a D. Next up, it's Mimic, which for 2 generic mana is a common artifact treasure. You sacrifice it and add 1 mana of any color, or you can pay 2 to have it become a shapeshifter artifact creature with base power and toughness 3/3 until end of turn. This doesn't seem awesome to me, though the flavor's cool. Like most treasures, it can only be used the one time to give you mana, so it isn't even amazing fixing, especially because you're paying 2 mana for it. And yeah, it can turn into a creature sometimes, and that's nice upside to have on your mana, but I'm just not sure this will feel like it's worth an entire card very often. I would much rather just play a creature that gave you a treasure with an enter the battlefield ability, and there's plenty of those in this set. You'll play it if you really need fixing, or if you're in black-red and you really like treasure, but that's about it. I'm giving it a D+. Next up, it's Spare Dagger, which for 1 generic mana is a common equipment. Equipped creature gets +1/+0 and has, whenever this creature attacks, you may sacrifice Spare Dagger. When you do, it deals 1 damage to any target, and it has an equip cost of 1. This has a cool design, but it doesn't feel like it will be very good and limited. The stats boost it offers is pretty weak, and giving up a whole card to ping something isn't really something I'm interested in most of the time. This is an equipment, and again, red-white cares about that, so maybe it gets played a little more often than it would in most formats, but I think it's a D+. Next up, it's Spiked Pit Trap, which for 1 generic mana is a common artifact with flash. You can pay 5 and tap it and sacrifice it. You choose a creature, and then you roll a d20. If you roll a 1 through 9, it deals 5 damage to that creature. And if you roll a 10 through 20, it deals 5 damage to that creature, and you get a creature token. Lots of sets lately seem to have an artifact that is a removal spell, and it is nice that you can play them in any deck, but they tend to be pretty inefficient, and that's kind of the case here. You pay 6 mana total for 5 damage, and you might also get a treasure. It does have flash, which makes it so you can at least ambush kill things sometimes, but yeah, you probably don't end up playing this unless you're short on good removal. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Treasure Chest, which for 3 generic mana is a rare artifact, and you can pay 4 and sacrifice it and roll a d20. If you roll a 1, you lose 3 life. If you roll a 2 through 9, you get 5 treasure tokens. If you roll a 10 through 19, you gain 3 life and draw 3 cards. And if you roll a 20, you search your library for a card, and if it's an artifact, you may put it onto the battlefield. Otherwise, put the card into your hand, then shuffle. So most of this time, this will do something. Rolling that 1 will feel brutal, but it won't happen often. But yeah, when you pay 7 mana and this just makes you lose 3 life, not going to feel great. Rolling 2 through 9 isn't the best thing ever either, as using up a card for 5 treasures won't always matter, but it is some nice fixing in ramp in most situations. You're really in business with 10 or more though. When you do that, this will have an insane effect, as drawing 3 cards and gaining 3 life will be enough to win you the game a lot of the time. Funnily enough, I don't think rolling a 20 will be better than 10 to 19 in most limited decks, so you will get the best effect here more often than most of these other cards that involve rolling a 20. The reason it won't be that good is that you have to have some really good artifact that's worth just cheating into play for the 20 to actually be worth it, and the chances you have that aren't great, and you'd probably rather just gain 3 life and draw 3 cards most of the time. Overall, this is weird because of the D20 stuff, and sometimes it's not going to feel great what it does. But again, 10 through 19 will happen often enough. If this were always able to allow you to pay 4, gain 3, and draw 3 cards, it would probably be like a B. But where it sits with the D20 stuff going on probably makes it a C+. Right, that's our last artifact. Let's move into lands now. First up, it's Cave of the Frost Dragon, a rare land, and it says if you control 2 or more other lands, it enters the battlefield tapped. You can tap it to add white mana, and you can pay 4 generic and a white to have it become a 3/4 white dragon creature with flying until end of turn. It's still a land. So there's a whole cycle of these monocolored creature lands in the set, and they're all pretty darn good. This might be the best one in the cycle. Having a land turn into an imposing flyer late in the game is incredible. Creature lands just feel like free cards so often, and having lands that actually do something late when you're flooding out is a good feeling, and this land can close out a game because it becomes a big flyer. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Den of the Bugbear, a rare land. It says if you control 2 or more other lands, it enters the battlefield tapped. You can tap it for red mana, and you can pay 3 generic and a red to have it become a 3/2 red goblin creature with, whenever this creature attacks, create a 1/1 red goblin creature token that's tapped and attacking. It's still a land. Again, creature lands are great. Having a land that can become an actual card in the later part of the game is awesome, and the creature this can become is definitely a nuisance, especially because it makes goblin friends to join in the fun. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Dungeon Descent, which is a rare land. It enters the battlefield tapped. You can tap it for colorless mana, and you can pay 4 and tap it, and tap an untapped legendary creature you control, venture into the dungeon, activate only as a sorcery. So there are a decent number of legends in this set, but I don't think there's going to be enough of them to get this off the ground most of the time. It's another one of these effects that's also only sorcery speed, so you have to leave yourself kind of vulnerable. Mostly it's going to be a tap land that hurts your mana base. I think it's just a D. Next up, it's Evolving Wilds, which is a common land. You can tap it and sacrifice it to search your library for a basic land, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. This is always really great fixing, as it makes it very easy to splash a third color while only running a single basic of that color, and that always feels great for your mana base. It also makes any mana base significantly better, even if you're just straight up 2 colors. You should value these over most solid cards, most C-level cards. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Hall of Storm Giants, which is a rare land. It enters the battlefield tapped. If you control 2 or more other lands, it can tap for blue, and you can pay 5 generic and a blue to have it become a 7/7 blue giant creature with Ward 3. It's still a land. Again, this cycle looks great. Creature lands don't take up a real slot in your deck, yet they can have a very real impact on games. This just can sit around and make mana for you early, and then when you get to the later part of the game, you can start sending it in after your opponent with all your extra mana. 6 mana is certainly a lot, but the beauty of this is that it gives you a great mana sink, something you usually want, and the creature it makes is no joke either. It can be a real problem on offense or defense for your opponent. And yeah, it will usually come into play tapped, like all of these will, but that's a fair price to pay. This is something you should take pretty highly. Don't underestimate these creature lands. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Hive of the Eye Tyrant, which is a rare land. It says if you control 2 or more other lands, it enters the battlefield tapped. You can tap it for black, and for 3 generic and a black, it can become a 3/3 black beholder creature with menace, and it says whenever this creature attacks, exile target card from defending player's graveyard. It's still a land. This might be a little less impressive than the rest of this cycle, but it is still an awesome creature land. A 3/3 with menace isn't exactly going to command the board all game long, but just having the ability to make one of your lands into one of those is great utility, and the exile effect might actually come up sometimes. This is another B. Our last land in this cycle is Lair of the Hydra, which is a rare land. If you control 2 or more other lands, it enters the battlefield tapped, and you can tap it for green, and you can pay X and a green to have it become an XX green Hydra creature. That's still a land. X can't be 0. This is more flexible than the others in that you can turn it into a land almost no matter how much mana you decide to pump into it. This means it can chip in for some damage early if it needs to, and it also means that in the extreme late game, it can be absolutely massive and difficult to take down. This is another B. Next up, it's Temple of the Dragon Queen, an uncommon land. When it enters the battlefield, you may reveal a dragon card from your hand. Temple of the Dragon Queen enters the battlefield tapped unless you reveal the dragon card this way, or you control a dragon. As it enters the battlefield, you choose a color, and you add 1 mana of the chosen color. Even without dragons, this offers some pretty nice fixing. It's always a little bit awkward with these types of lands that make you choose a color, because sometimes you have to play it earlier and name the color of something you aren't splashing just because you need a different color of mana. But this still looks like the kind of fixing that will help decks splash stuff. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Treasure Vault, a rare artifact land that can tap for colorless mana, and for XX, you can sack it and create X treasure tokens. I think this land is probably worth running in most decks, despite only producing colorless mana at first. It really overcomes most of that shortcoming by being able to make treasure. In the end, it probably doesn't really hurt your mana base since you actually can give it up for treasure, which can produce mana of any color. And in the later part of the game, you might be able to make some really silly amount of treasure, which could be nice if you have a mana sink around. This is a land that gives you some reasonable fixing and ramp, and I think that seems solid enough, giving it a C+. So those are all of the multicolored, white, and colorless cards in Dungeons & Dragons Adventures of the Forgotten Realms. Tomorrow, I'll be back with a look at the blue and black cards in this set in part 2. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can stay aware of future videos, including the rest of this set review. Thanks for watching.